The topic today came about because we've gotten a lot of requests from our clients asking about what competitors that we service, what they're doing from a KPI perspective. Now, we have NDAs in place, so we can't really share much of that information, but it's also difficult to answer because our answer is always going to be, it depends. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on what the company is actually doing. Are they in perishables? Are they in non-perishables? What situation are they in? Are they, where are they at from a maturity level of their operation? Where are they at from a maturity level of their technology and their data, their processes? That's going to determine a lot of that. And then what are the goals? Are they looking at short-term goals? Or are they looking at long-term goals? And so it depends type of scenario. And as we have been dealing a lot of these questions, we started realizing, whoa, there's like a lot of myths going around about what people think they should be focusing on from a KPI perspective. And some of the myths that we want to break is number one, there's silver bullet KPIs. A lot of people think that there's some KPIs that if they magically focus their business on it, it'll transform their business. And that's a myth. A lot of those kind of KPIs will only get you to a par level. It won't be able to really accelerate your business. And so really you need to understand your business a lot more and really figure out what can take you to that next level. Another myth is that KPIs are static. They actually change over time depending on what position you're in at your company and what phase you're on your growth. It'll change. And another myth we want to bust is that the C-suite and the board should be focused on table stake KPIs. If you focus on those things, you're only going to be able to keep up. You're not going to be really able to accelerate your business. Now, as we talk through these things, I wanted to go over a couple of terms that may be familiar with you, maybe not. But I wanted to go over this because as you turn your business into a digital business, you'll find that a lot of these terms that are used in software development are going to be commonly used in a digital business. So, the first term here is SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle, or Application Development Lifecycle is a process for planning, creating, and testing deployment. And it's a continuous improvement type model where, especially as you're formulating digital processes in your business, you'll find that to be really helpful to continuously improve those digital processes. Agile is a common term. I think a lot of people are using this term in business as well. It originated in software development, and it's a practice. It's a practice in involving discovering requirements and developing solutions through the collaborative effort with multiple different teams, marketing, operations, finance. It's a cross-functional team workflow. And it's very iterative, and it's in shorter increments. It's versus the long scoped out multi-year looking at like waterfall type engagements. It's that waterfall is also a project management term, but you'll see Agile being used a lot in digital business discussions. And then business value stream. Now we're going to show you a version of business value stream here, but a business value stream is a series of processes that provide value to your business, whether it's for your internal business or for your customer, but it's really identifying those combination of processes that create that value. So this is a dashboard that we like to use. And the reason we like to do this with our clients is it helps really identify what are the key processes that bring results for the business. Instead of looking at departments or instead of looking at systems, which is the common way of looking at and coming up with KPIs, this view really helps identify what's around the corner of your department, what's around the corner of your system, and really identify, how all of these different systems, people, workflows, systems are all playing together. Please keep in mind that when you're talking about KPIs, there's various different levels of them, starting from awareness all the way up to impact-driven APIs. And, some of these KPIs are quantitative, some of them are qualitative. And these KPIs, each company in their environment is going to be different in the way they correlate, the way they analyze together and are influencing each other. This right here is a CQI model, sort of showcasing that SDLC lifecycle look. It's a continuous improvement model that really helps look at the business, not just from a static standpoint, but as it evolves, as you come up with different tests and different measurements, and as you evolve and improve and grow the business. It's a continuous improvement model here. Now, why do we do this? Why do companies do digital transformations and try to manage their businesses this way? Well, let's take a look here. This is a view of what Amazon's market valuation was in 2017 in comparison to Walmart, Target, Best Buy, Macy's, so on and so forth. They're about 50% bigger back in 2017. And that was a big thing. People were sort of questioning, whether Amazon was going to exist or in the early 2000s because they were bleeding so much money. Now you look here and compare Amazon in 2021. Now they're 3 times larger than Walmart, Target, and these other companies. And the reason why Amazon was able to grow so quickly is because they have this continuous improvement model, this SDLC model. They're using Agile processes for every part of their business, not just in software development, but the way their entire company operates and integrates together. We've got a very impressive panel today. To have a very interesting discussion about this very topic. Bob Van Dusen over here, he's an executive partner at Pandoblox, but prior to that, he was head of all of technology, including IT operations and deployment technologies for Blizzard Entertainment, and he was head of technology over at Honest Company as well, the very known consumer brand. David Lapisse, he's our CTO of digital operations. He used to be the CTO at United Talent Agency and CIO of Ziffern law firm. Pat Turpin, former co-founder of Popchips. He was also the president there, and he was a former VP over at Costco. And Pete Hudd, he's a CIO, CTO, sort of a joint role here over at Capital Brands. Everyone knows Capital Brands as the NutriBullet. He's also someone that I know who's exited more companies than most other CIOs I know here in Southern California. So congratulations on the last M&A. He was also over at Quest Nutrition Bars and Cypress Creek Renewables, very known consumer brands. So enough of the PowerPoint. I'm going to dive into the fun part. So, a lot of what we're talking about here is important at all levels, whether it's board, executives, middle management. But we wanted to give a view that's integrated, that's an integrated view, and so have a lot of different perspectives here in this panel. But I want to start off with Pat from a board level and start from top down. From your experience, Pat, you've been at multiple different companies and you're doing a lot of consulting, board level consulting for CPG companies. From from your experience as a board member, what do you look for in company KPIs?
Sure, Henry. I look for KPIs that give insights and information relative to a handful of critical issues a company may have. Because as a board member, I get management teams that want to give me 70-page PowerPoint decks that have mountains of data, but very little real information. Highlights of sales wins, marketing prowess, but it doesn't really tell me how we're progressing towards our strategic objectives or not. So as I think you mentioned before, Henry, I also believe that there is no silver bullet, one size fit all KPIs. I don't have like my favorite 5 or anything like that. KPIs are different for each company based on the specifics of the situation. And good KPIs, in my experience, cut through the crap and allow for good discussion around why things are trending either towards or away from that goal. I'll give you an example. A CPG brand that's in early stages of growth wants to focus on sales dollars as one of their KPIs. But the sales dollars were misleading to the question of the real viability of the business model, because it didn't differentiate between pipeline fill, which is rolling out inventory to new accounts, trial, a customer who tries it for the first time, versus repeat sales. And so we needed to develop a way to measure repeat purchase and tie that back to the cost of acquiring a customer. I've literally seen numerous brands go several years growing sales, thinking they were tracking, and hadn't really focused in on this issue, and only to find several years later their business model is kind of a leaky bucket in terms of customer retention. So they're getting lots of trial but no repeat. And so their business model wasn't as sustainable as they thought. So once you design relevant KPIs for a particular business in its situation, getting the data in terms of both access and accuracy is a whole nother matter altogether. And I think that goes more to the expertise of others on the panel.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And it's the process of coming up with those KPIs that's really important. Anyone here have some examples that they'd like to share?
I think the KPIs are really the how do you measure if you're being successful, but there's a precursor to that, and I'll throw out another acronym that folks like, OKRs, or the objectives and key results. That's really the what. And you have the KPIs that are designed usually bottom up. So once the OKRs are in place and dictated, where the company wants to go, then you can figure out what KPIs are best going to track those and make sure that you can hit those objectives that you have.
Sounds good. David, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think the other part was, going back to your question, Henry, really goes through, and it's being able to set up a culture where you're collecting the data to be able to report on it. And, back to Pat's point, the management could want to look at certain metrics, but it's all about, it's getting all the way down to your line workers to where they have opportunities to collect the data to be able to do that in a clean and succinct manner within their workflow. I think that's what I've seen has always been the challenging part of it. So it really needs to go through, and in a company, it needs to be part of that culture. We need the data to be able to understand our business, to be able to make the changes necessary to continue to grow, to continue to be competitive, can continue to understand the clients. And I think a lot of times that I've seen that, companies will go through, especially when they have to fire drill, that, that they won't pay attention to that data collection. And it really comes back and becomes a much more expensive proposition as they move forward. But I think that that's kind of the one thing that should always be in the back of everybody's mind is in this day and age, is that I have to collect the data and I will be able to use it to my benefit. And every decision that needs to be a priority. And when it's not, it really comes back and really bites companies down the road. You just lose so much valuable insight every day you're not focused on it.
Yeah.
So I tend to have a love-hate relationship with metrics and statistics. It's something that I absolutely love and appreciate in terms of an analytical perspective. But I think the tendency is to stop asking questions. If one thing I know for sure is that you can actually manipulate data, or if you ask the correct questions, you can actually get the result that you're looking for. So you have to be very cautious about that. I have actually had IBM Watson's sales rep come into my shop once and was touting how their job was to make me look good. And I started laughing by responding, well, A, my team are a bunch of nerds, so we're never going to look good. But B, the whole point of analytics is to expose the areas that you're blind to or that you're not doing well as a company. So it's not about looking good. It's about finding out where the disadvantages that are hidden and actually improving upon that to give you a competitive edge. So it's a very different mindset when it comes to how you look at data. And to both Dave and Pat's points, it's important to not lose sight of the overall business objectives. Without that, you're just going to spend an awful lot of money on these nerdy IT guys that, you're not quite sure what you're getting in return. And that's a very tough place to be if you're sitting in our chairs at the C level to justify your budgets. I mean, every dollar is going to be important. So what is the return on that? And you have to constantly be in a position where you're constantly questioning things and just asking the very difficult questions. Because if you're not willing to do that, to David's point, the data doesn't matter. I mean, you can collect all you want, but if you're just not going to take a really hard, honest look at it, then it's going to be very challenging.
You have a really good point there. So what's an example where that you guys have experienced the company lose sight of the goal? Like, what are some situations, through things that you can share where the business has lost sight?
I guess I could start with that. So I always pick on marketing because they're my favorite target. It's always a love-hate thing because I always appreciate great marketing, but it's a very rare thing. And from my perspective, one of the things that I always drive my marketing teams crazy with is I always tell them, come with data. Where's your data? Where's your evidence to back this up? And what drives them crazy is not only do I ask them when they show up with it, I beat them mercilessly over their head with questions about the data. So a good example of this was when I was at Quest Nutrition. We had just signed a deal with Walmart. And it was a big deal because there was a lot of resistance to Walmart that we weren't sure if they were the right fit or the right audience per se. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was we had a field marketing team that basically went to stores and set up and they did sampling and education about our products. And so the field marketing team came prepared to a meeting where they said, hey, we focused in the New Orleans area in Louisiana, and there were 3 Walmarts in the area. We set up shop in one. And this is our analysis of how effective we were. So they were showing how, within the week that they were there, they had a 20% lift in sales, and the residual lift was still anywhere from 10 to 12% in the following 6 weeks. And they looked at that and said there was no cannibalization within the other 2 Walmarts. So they thought this was a resounding success. And so I kind of chimed in and said, well, what's been the impact in the Louisiana and the New Orleans area overall on our sales, whether it be from other vendors or through online sales and everything else? And turns out that it did in fact cannibalize sales because the net sales had remained the same, but it was just taken away from other areas. So, again, if you don't ask those types of questions, it may seem like it's a resounding success, but at the same time, overall, from my chair, it wasn't, because we didn't gain any net sales as a result of it. So at least not from the data that we saw. So those are the types of things that you have to really be prepared to kind of be skeptical and ask about.
It's a great example. David, United Talent Agency, you've been there for a long time. You were there for, I think, 10 years, and you were the CTO over there. Not everyone has the kind of budgets UTA does. The $1 billion a year company, but you started there before, way before it was that large. And I think a lot of executives, they look at this challenge of coming up with KPIs and the data, like you were talking about, the data to justify those KPIs and model those KPIs. And a lot of executives would think of it as a big daunting task, like more of like a Holy Grail position to be in. As they grow, they want to wait for these systems to be automated and whatnot. I think one of the key things that a lot of executives need to know is that you don't have to wait for that. You don't have to wait for that Holy Grail position. What are some things that you've seen are tricks that, to get those KPIs, get that data, sooner than later?
I think that it's going through working with a company that's grown or any other small company is you focus on having what data you have to have the good data is to start somewhere, right? It's the eating the elephant, and to be able to show that there's data there that's really actionable. A little bit of it is education work. A little bit of it is just making sure that you're able to correlate and present what you have. That's really, it's good data can be used in any way. I mean, whether it's KPIs, whether it even goes into more advanced projects. This is kind of a little bit off the topic, but you start getting into AI, machine learning. You don't need a lot of data to be successful in projects. You just need it to be clean. And you just need to be able to put it in front of the right people. Whether it's at the C-suite, one of the successes that we had was actually going through early on is starting to work with individual departments. I think one of the myths is that the KPIs are really only important to the C-suite, right? That they're going to look at all of those data, and I think that it's really crucial, and it's to have it permeate, right? Department heads, to be able to go that they understand their departments better through metrics, and was able to have success with that before there was any, as we're really moving into the systems. So I think that one of the big myths is that you can start with small amounts of data. You can start without having the advanced systems, the Salesforces and the Workdays and the SAPs and the Oracles in place. And it does take a little bit more work. It is a lot of Excel it does help to have some Excel jockeys, but start somewhere. And really, because A, it starts giving your business value, and B, it starts having that conversation around metrics and being able to run, making empirical decisions.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Bob, what about you? Honest Company, when you started there, you left an illustrious career at Blizzard. You were there for 14 years at Blizzard, and then you left Blizzard for a small and scrappy startup, Honest Company, right? What was it like there? As you grew that company for an exit and grew it to that next level, what were some of your experiences there?
Yeah, Honest was actually really interesting. They're, overall they're CPG, but they had B2B, they had B2C, they had subscription, they had mobile. So there were quite a few outlets and quite a few things that we needed to keep an eye on, depending on what those objectives were. And we usually set the objectives on a quarterly basis, and then we adjusted the KPIs accordingly. But some of those, depending on what quarter and where we needed to improve and really dive down deep, would be like net revenue, direct contribution to margin, cost per new subscriber, and definitely retention on the subscription side. But to the earlier point that Dave was making, we were a small, scrappy startup, and the data that we had was not necessarily what you would see at a more mature company that had been around for a while. You had a lot of folks that were keeping data on spreadsheets and things like that. So one thing that is important is to get that data clean and make sure that there's agreement across the board on where that single source of truth is. If it's a spreadsheet and you're a small company, great, but everybody should be looking at that number so that if you're asked for a particular number and you ask a couple different departments for it, you're going to come back with the same calculation, the same number, and not three different numbers. That was one of the hurdles that we needed to get over that was difficult at first, but that kind of goes into the new way of doing things that you had pointed to earlier in that Amazon slide. Amazon has adopted across the board this software development mentality in all of their departments, which includes continuous improvement and being able to identify where we were falling down, where data wasn't matching, and go back and drill down and say, okay, well, why didn't that happen? Okay, it was because of X, Y, and Z. Well, why did X, Y, and Z happen? It's because of A, B, and C. Well, why did A, B, and C happen? And you drill down until you get to that root cause, fix the root cause. And eventually, I think Dave mentioned a little while ago, how do you eat an elephant? It's one bite at a time. That's really what it took. So.
Very cool. Well, no, this is all great insights, Bob, but how was it working with Jessica Alba?
It was a lot of fun. Jessica was, she definitely loved hanging out with her team, and she worked really hard, believe it or not. People were really surprised. She was in the office at least 4 days a week, if not 5. That, there were some times where she was out of town, but she was a hard worker, and she definitely played hard as well. So had a lot of fun.
Were there any KPIs that she would get fixated on that you could share?
It varied. It really depended on what those objectives were for the period of time. I was continually impressed that she was a pretty savvy businesswoman. Not just an actress, but that is a name. But she actually cared about the business. She cared about the product. She cared about the clients. And so when it came to the executive team coming up with those objectives and how we were going to measure them, that's what she fixated on, was what is the team all about, and what are we up to this quarter or this semi-annual session. It varied.
Very cool. Very cool. I feel like you have some stories back there, but we'll move on. I'm seeing questions coming through. Before we get into the Q&A, I wanted to bring the conversation back up a little bit at the board level. Pat, as companies are transitioning from brick and mortar into digital, into e-commerce, how do you evaluate from a board or an investor, the degree of attractiveness of a company? How do you rate the success that you would place towards the valuation of that business, as they transition?
I think it starts with exit strategy. You're building something that others have to value, or else you don't have a very viable exit strategy. And so it's being clear on what the market values, because who the buyer of a digital business is versus the buyer of a business that's primarily brick and mortar, sometimes there's overlap. A lot of times they're very different. Therefore, what they value is different, and being clear on that. So it's one thing to build sales, it's another thing to build value. So that's kind of the starting point, and that starts to then lead to assessing kind of at the next level the profitability profile and the cash requirements of those two very different businesses, and using that to kind of determine how you want to allocate resources. And by resources, I don't just mean cash, it's people and other resources as well. I mean, I'll give you an example of a company that a CPG business that I'm involved with that had both a e-commerce segment that was D2C, direct to consumer, and a segment that's through third-party marketplaces like Amazon. Well, the direct to consumer was far more cash intensive because of the marketing spend required to acquire customers than the cost of, say, growing through third-party marketplaces. But there were certain value attributes with growing the direct-to-consumer business, whether it was data and knowledge of the customers, controlling the customer relationship, you can go on and on. So ultimately, at the board level, the decision was it needs to be grown large enough to be deemed completely viable from the kind of buyer that would value this business. But we don't necessarily want to dilute the shareholders to the point where it becomes the sole focus of the business. And so a balance was struck. So again, every situation is a little different, but it kind of starts with what's a viable exit strategy and making sure you're building something that somebody's going to really value.
Awesome. Here's some questions that are popping up. Feel free to jump in, whomever wants to take it. How do you balance between the desire to implement KPIs quickly versus implementing highly customized, insightful, actionable KPIs?
You don't. I think it comes down to the groups that are asking, and it's also too about what can be delivered with the data that you have. I think that's part of the art rather than the science of being able to put it together, especially when you're just getting into it as a company. It is that when you my experience is when you start the product, it's when you start the process. Henry, I think you brought up a good term there, is the agile side of it. It's being able to do it in a way that you experiment. You put data out there. You have your business be able to understand what you see as that data. If they're not, you've got to push it a little bit, and you just start iterating. And the one thing that I would just want to address in that question is it's not a versus. Insightful is insightful. How deep, how actionable it is, the time frames that are, those are all that, that's dependent on the KPIs. But if there's value in the data, if the data is accurate and it can be modeled, it's insightful, whether it was done quick or whether it was done with, a set of MBAs over many years to be able to get to that. So, but again, start somewhere, and when the business sees the value of it, then you get to the part where it's, the dashboarding and the deep, the deep analytics and all the rest of it, but start somewhere.
What about Bob? Their take on that?
Well, I think it's, if I understand the question, it's really moving the ball forward. So we had talked about table stakes KPIs. Those are probably the easiest and most well-defined. So execute on those first. And in parallel, spin off a couple teams that take a look at your value streams, your company value streams, dig down into those company value streams and figure out what processes make up those streams. And then how do you measure those processes for improvement? Because if you're able to get those sub-processes that are part of the overall value stream to improve, that value stream is going to improve, and it's going to improve either the value coming into your business or the value going out to your client.
Yeah, and that really resonates. And I like what David said about it's not about versus. There's a lot of practical KPIs you can get that it can be very customizable and very insightful to your business. And it might be just right under your nose. It's a matter of figuring out ways to visualize them better and to get a lot of the cross-functional teams to be able to work together to look at those and come up with those together. That's the hardest part, I think, is in really getting the departments to actually work together towards that goal, because you're not going to do it just by looking at one set of data and not interfacing with a bunch of different people to analyze it and make actionable corrections on that. Pete, did you have anything on that question before we moved?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that really wasn't brought up is what's the end goal for the KPIs, right? And one of the challenges I always see, especially if you're using KPIs to manage people, and this is where the love-hate relation comes into play. People will play to the KPI. No matter what you do, they will always play to the KPI. And a good example I have is, one of the things I would do is I'd walk the factory floor where we made our protein bars at Quest Nutrition. And, whenever you start a new batch, there's a slabber that actually rolls the bars out before it gets guillotine cut and then roller cut. And so the thickness of, everything is done by weight. So the weight of the bar is ultimately what you're going to get in a package. And so the thickness is the biggest variant in that. So you have to adjust. When a new batch comes out, there's always the first few feet, if not a few yards, are always kind of wasted because the thickness is off. And one of the things the reason I got involved was because we tried to put measurements and automate some of the machinery. And so one day I went there and I noticed a couple of workers were constantly, like it was a new batch, and they were just constantly adjusting the machine, which I thought was what they should be doing. It turns out they weren't adjusting the slabber. They were adjusting the tolerance of what weight was going to be acceptable, because they were paid bonuses based on the amount of waste or the lack of waste per batch. Mm-hmm. So it was in their best interest to make sure there was as little waste as possible. And instead of fixing the slabber, they were actually adjusting the waste measurement. And so, I asked them, like, what are you guys doing? And they just kind of, very casually said, oh, we're just adjusting it so we can hit our metrics for the shift. And, I just walked away going, wow, that's amazing. And it just goes to show, like, if you're not careful and you don't really kind of assess what those KPIs are in terms of what you're going to use them for, people are going to be left to their own druthers, and they're going to basically play to the KPIs. So, everyone pretty much is, I think, in alignment that you got to start somewhere. Once you start getting the numbers, start digging deeper, start asking the hard questions, and don't just be okay with, oh, well, that's the metric we're using, and never question it again. I think that's one of the hard lessons that I've learned over time, just because human behavior is such that if that's what they're measured on, that's what they're going to figure out a way to maximize that.
Yeah. It's a lot of practical adjustments, like you said. The getting involved and really figuring out the whys. And a lot of what we do is just asking why 5 to sometimes 10 different times. It gets a little redundant, but I think it shows how much management, what level of management is required per department by how many whys you ask. Here's a question. What type of data was used in informing department heads in David's scenario? I think it was referencing you, David, to help them operate their areas of the business. What operational efficiencies were found?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that when in my experience with service companies, it is, what I started with, and this is from, antiquated accounting systems, is just started correlating and looking at revenue cycles. And I remember this really clearly, is going through And to a certain point, it's revenue would come in, and it would, you'd have when revenue would come in and go up and down. And some of it was like, well, that's just what the business is. And I'm like, okay, if that's what the business is it consistent? And then when specifically there was a one department head, that's when they started looking at it and started questioning. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense about what I know for the business. It shouldn't, the curve shouldn't look like this. I would expect to see some spikes or some changes here. And that's, starting with a very simple, easy to find number that's very consistent, very accurate, especially in a service company, and being able to get it in front of the right business department, and just starting to work with them and working with them to ask questions. Is this what you expect it to look like? I don't. Okay, how can we then, if it's not, if this isn't what you're expected to look like, again, this goes into, the same thing, whether it's manufacturing or any side of it, is then you go down and look at what's kind of those underlying business processes that are affecting and not producing, what are the root causes of that? Something very simple. And then it can get more complex as it goes in, is the department heads and those underlying those individual business units become more complex. The one thing that I did find is, especially in small to medium-sized companies, what's a nice way to put this? That different department heads have definitely different levels of maturity when it comes to using data and being able to be successful with that. Wouldn't want to name any names at this point, but when you have a win in a department, don't think that you can replicate it without work going into other departments. So I see Peter laughing at that, so I'm sure that you've run across that too. So.
Yeah, definitely shared similar experiences. I mean, it's annoying, but the answer is it depends. Like every circumstance, every department head, and even within a department, the middle level folks that'll actually start really doing the yeoman's work in terms of using the reports and the analysis tools. It depends. Right now I'm sitting at a company where the top three guys are very much addicted to Excel spreadsheets. They don't want to see a dashboard. And if you send them a dashboard, they don't know what to do with it. So it's a challenge. But yet the mid-level folks, they all love all the different analysis tools that we've given them, and they can drill down and export from there and, visualize things, and they can just see things at a glance. So it does depend on, what ultimately, what the department's needs are. And it is kind of an art form to kind of navigate those conversations to basically try to extract exactly what they need. And sometimes it just takes, like what Dave was talking about earlier, just start somewhere, just come up with a report, come up with analysis dashboard, see what they think, and then it'll get them in the context and framework of, oh, this is what this stuff can do. And then they start to look at it and be like, oh, it'd be really cool if I could see this analysis. And you're like, great. And then you just make adjustments and iterate accordingly. So it's hard. Sometimes some people run ahead of you and try to, force the issue and get what they really want. Others, you have to lead them to water a little bit, and kind of assure them not to be afraid that this stuff isn't gonna harm them in any way, and it's actually there to help them. So and then you've got people who fear transparency. So one of the challenges that my team constantly faces is just trying to figure out who's okay with this stuff being published and who's not, and that's a cultural. Every company I've been at has different perspectives on that. I've been at some organizations where the sales team does not want to release any information until it's time for them to release the information. I've been at other places where transparency was of paramount importance, so there was no surprises. So it just depends on every environment, every department head. It's going to be different, and that's part of the challenge as IT professionals, is that typically we're not very good at conversing with people, but that's really what allows you to access to get in their world, to really understand what that can mean.
Great insight. Bob, did you have an example to share before I move on to the next question? You're on mute.
Yeah, not anything that's coming to mind at the moment, but
Okay. Here's a question that was pointed to Pete. So what does looking good actually equate to in terms of how you deliver the analytics and reporting?
Well, it's not this, I'll tell you that. But yeah, my measurement actually, since we're talking about KPIs, the way I measure things is I actually look at usage. So if the end users are actually going into the tools and looking at stuff and drilling into it, we can track all that stuff. So we know who's logging in, who's not logging in, who's sharing the information. We have all that metrics on the back end side of things. So adoption for me is always the hallmark of any good tool. If people use it and they can actually make a case study of like how it's actually impacted them positively and what they're using it for, that's a win. And so they could be very small, they could be very big, but you just kind of want to rack up those wins and just show that the technology is there to help them. So that's to me what looking good is just widespread adoption.
Very cool. Very cool. Here's a question. I think this is targeted for Bob. What are some of the OKR myths that this team have experienced or pursued OKR data and reporting that have experienced in pursuing OKR data and reporting?
I'm not sure if there are really myths per se, if I'm understanding the question right, but I'll try and get to the intention of the question. I think that there's a discipline in the OKRs. There's actually two parts, and that's well defining what the objective is and making sure that that objective is, quantitative, that it's ambitious, that it's actionable, and that it's time bound, so that you have a way to accurately measure it. And then the other part is obviously the key results, and you need to make sure that you can take those qualities that I had just mentioned and distill those down into something that you can monitor, and you can decide at the end of whatever period you've chosen whether you hit the mark, how far off the mark you were, if you need to continue to improve. Hopefully that gets to the intention, but I guess if there are any myths, it would be that OKRs, you could quickly dictate what those OKRs are without actually doing the work behind it to make sure that all of those aspects are there so that they could be measurable. Hopefully that answers the question, and it's somewhat.
Yeah. Okay, we've got 11 minutes left. I'm going to raise the discussion a little bit. There was a question about SaaS and typical like KPIs that SaaS companies use, and I think we can look at it from an e-commerce standpoint as well. But before we take that question, I'd like to raise that question a little bit higher, because when we answer that question, the fear that I have of answering that question is it gets back into our discussion about silver bullet KPIs, right? Like we want our customers to realize that they shouldn't really be focusing on those like silver bullet KPIs. It's really dependent on a lot of different things. And so before we answer that question on, what are some like e-commerce KPIs that are typical, I think the best way to answer that question would be, pointed towards you, Pat. From a board level perspective, when companies are valuing, an e-commerce brand or a consumer brand that's digital, what are some things that you've seen as to be the most, focused KPIs, from that level?
Boy, you run the risk again at trying to take silver bullets when they don't really exist. Because I'll be honest, and Pete, I see, is laughing because he's been through enough exits where I'm sure he's experienced that too. It really comes down to, what is it that that business is being valued for? Is it because its brand is so great? Is it because its product is so has so much IP that it's so unique it can't be like, what is it, that's really valuable here? And you tend to have metrics that spawn out of that. So if it's a brand that's touting, it's got just fantastic DTC presence, you're going to see metrics around brand health, around the cohort data, and how frequently, what percentage of those customers are returning customers, and for how long, how sticky is it? So again, it really gets to what others were saying before, is you have to really get to root cause and ask why about 500 times to kind of get to root cause. And then designing those metrics becomes very straightforward. That's not the challenge. The challenge is asking why enough times that you get to root cause. And I don't know about the other panelists, but the mistake I see a lot of companies make is they don't get to root cause. They get to some surface level metrics that fill up a dashboard. People feel good about it, and everybody calls it a win and goes on. And they never get to root cause.
Pat, I've got a question too with your experience, though, is as you are growing a company, that there are different phases of it, and getting, as a company goes through maturity, it's getting kind of new priorities that you look at as they go through. Is that a challenge for you to go through as, you're raising this, it's growing from an infant to an adult, and there are different priorities at different stages of that to get the teams to be able to look at, or the departments to look at new priorities based on the maturity of the companies as you grow them?
100%. I couldn't agree with that statement more, David. And it's really hard to do. It's, in some regards, when it's a fast growing company, it can feel like changing a tire on a car while you're going 100 miles an hour down the freeway. Easier said than done. But it's also hard for the board, as just as much from the company. And that's a lot of time the board's challenge is to try to help the company look around corners and ask, are we focused on the right things, with the key word being right now? Because when you're growing fast, things do change and evolve. And what was critical last year may not be the critical issue in front of you next year. And how do you get in front of that so that you're leaning into it at the right time and not just being purely reactionary because one part of your house is on fire, which is, by the way, what typically happens. But really successful companies are able to make those adjustments to manage growth, or else, and I'm the non-technical guy on the panel, but I've experienced the pain of what happens when a company outgrows its systems. And you tend to not notice it until you feel the pain, and it's not a quick fix. And so that's something that, as a board member, I'm particularly sensitive to, because other problems are faster to fix.
Good point. Very interesting. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question, and I want to ask this to Pat. How does a digital transformation, how does that change the scope of the board member's mandate? Take, for example, a brick and mortar business evolving into an e-commerce business. How does that change the board's mandate?
Yeah, I mean, in the interest of time, I'll say, I think we kind of covered that already as it relates to looking at what the exit strategy of the business is, what's valued in that exit strategy, what buyers will value, and then trying to allocate resources of people, money, time accordingly. So I think we kind of covered that before, and I would give you the same answer.
Okay. Got it. Okay, well, we've got 4 minutes left. Any other last things that we want to mention before we wrap up?
I think that if I was going to ask for everybody to take away one thing, it is, don't wait for, that you think you have to be ready for a Tableau or Looker or fancy dashboard project. If you aren't looking at numbers or trying to be, kind of creative about, looking at KPIs and putting them together. If you can doing it in Excel has worked for many companies for many years off of basic data. I'd encourage everybody, just start somewhere. Though, it's the perfect, and this is definitely one of those areas that the perfect is the enemy of the good is I think really holds true. So.
I love that. The good. All right. Well, thank you everyone for getting together, sharing your knowledge, sharing your insights. Hope everyone found this useful. Happy Tuesday. Thank you. Until next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.